Hello, you're listening to the West Cork History Festival podcast. For more about the festival and other recordings, go to our website at www.westcorkhistoryfestival.org. My name's Simon Kingston, and I'm one of the co-founders of the festival.
And I'm Victoria Kingston, the other co-founder. The talk you're about to listen to was recorded at our 2024 festival and features two leading historians in conversation about their careers and history more generally. They are Professor Roy Foster and Professor Margaret MacMillan.
Roy Foster was Carroll Professor of Irish History at Oxford between 1991 and 2016. He's a huge figure in the Irish historical scene, authorised biographer of Yeats and writer of many definitive books on the Irish experience in the 19th and 20th centuries, and he's also the honorary president of the West Cork History Festival.
Margaret MacMillan is Emeritus Professor of History at the University of Toronto and Emeritus Professor of International History and former Warden of St Anthony's College at the University of Oxford. Her work focuses on the history of international relations in the 19th and 20th century, and her most famous book is about the Paris Peace Conferences. Her most recent book is War, How Conflict Shaped Us, published in 2020.
We hope you'll enjoy the conversation between Margaret and Roy, wide-ranging, highly topical last August and still so now.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Victoria. And thank you for all you've done in starting this remarkable institution, from its beginnings in tents in your garden to the spectacular surroundings we're in now. And it's a particular delight to be here with Margaret, an old friend from Oxford and an interlocutor with me on several previous occasions. I've often thought the world would be a much better place if it could be governed by Canadian women. If you think of the emotional intelligence and a stringent good sense of Margaret Atwood or Alice Munro, and I have to say Margaret MacMillan is of that kidney. So, future world governor Margaret, to add to the other.
Be careful.
To add to the other encomia. But the theme of this conference is aftermath. And I think we want to look at that a little, and Margaret being a great historian of the aftermath of the First World War, a subject whose parameters have extended and changed remarkably in recent historiography. But I think we might also go on to wonder whether we're in a period of prelude rather than aftermath, given the sometimes chilling parallels with what we see happening around us today. And you said recently that you are now living through the kind of period you used to write about. Do you still feel that?
Yes, and I wish I wasn't, in a way. I mean, I'm fascinated by when things begin to fall apart and great change takes place. But living in the middle of it is disconcerting and worrying. And I worry about the next generations. I'm part of that, and you are too, I think, that those very fortunate generations that came. I was born just at the end of the Second World War. And so I grew up in what was a very stable world, Canada, booming economy. Yes, the Cold War was on, and there were moments when we worried we were all going to be blown to pieces, but those were only moments, and for the most part, we were incredibly fortunate. And now I think, what's the next generation coming along, my great nieces and nephews? What are they going to face? I mean, they've got climate change, they've got a very unstable international situation, societies which seem to be more polarized than certainly I remember in my lifetime, democratic societies. So, yes, I mean, it's fascinating, and I wish I weren't living through it.
I think was it Napoleon who said that if you wanted to understand someone, you had to look at what was happening in the world when they were 20 years old, which in our cases would be the 1960s.
Yeah.
I was 20 in 1969.
Well, you're a mere baby, I can tell you. I can tell you about life now. I didn't realize. I graduated from the University of Toronto in 1966, and the change was just enormous. And change for women was enormous. It was the early women's movement, just was beginning. The idea that women could do the same sorts of things that men were already doing was a huge change. And it was a time of hope. Now people say the 60s also opened the way for a more selfish society, more focus on the self. I don't know if this is true, but it clearly was a time of great change.
It was a time of great expectation that I think we thought that religion was, fundamentalist religion was finished. I think we thought that nationalism was on the way out. I remember much later than that, Eric Hobsbawm giving the Wiles lectures at Oxford on nationalism, at Queen's Belfast, on nationalism, and saying that we could finally understand it because the owl of Minerva was flying at twilight, as Hegel said. It was finished, so we could understand it. I mean, how wrong can a great Marxist historian be?
But historians, I think, should never try and predict the future. We so often get it wrong. Now, I remember a historian friend of mine in Canada slightly later on. I think it was post-Cold War, and it was the great age of globalization. He said, it's wonderful. He said, you know, everyone around the world is going to be listening to Michael Jackson. And I thought, look where that's gone.
That moment has been and gone. What we can learn from history, if anything, and you've written a book of the uses and abuses of history, which I've returned to many times, predisposes us to think that there are, if not repetitions, cycles of the kind of moment, this is what we began by saying, that come around again. I think a cyclical view of history, and I say this as a Yeatsian, Yeats believed implicitly in cycles of history, is a very dangerous and I don't quite know how to put it, but it's not a way to bring about clear understanding. There are different images of repetition in history, though, which Louis Namier wrote about, which Isaiah Berlin, in a very precocious essay, wrote about, where he said history didn't recur in cycles, it recurred in folds. There were moments when, if you visualized a piece of fabric falling to the floor and peaking and folding over and over again, that was a way to understand repetitions in history, rather than an inexorable Yeatsian cycle of every 20,000 years.
Yes, that's a very nice image. I think I hadn't heard it, so thank you. I think the danger in the cycle is you throw your hands up and say, what can we do? It's going to happen. I mean, the Chinese, classical China had this cyclical tradition, the cycle of history, where you would get a strong emperor seizing the throne and getting the mandate of heaven, usually often an outsider, like the Manchu, the last dynasty of China, or the Mongols who came in and ruled China for a century and a bit. And then gradually the descendants wouldn't be as good. They'd be spoiled. They grew up in the court. They weren't as tough as the founders. And so finally there would be internal unrest and rebellion and quite often attacks from outside. And then the cycle would start all over again. And I think you can see it, and you can see how regimes grow old and tired. But I think the idea that the cycle just repeats itself and nothing much changes is wrong. In fact, even in classical China, things were changing and new ideas were coming in and new technologies were coming in. And so I think, yes, we can see, I think we're seeing a period now where we've perhaps too much losing faith in our own institutions and our own elites. I mean, when you look at the list of professions, I mean, journalists come down about there at the bottom. Politicians are about the same. Doctors, I think, are still trusted, but we've lost somehow trust in that those who claim to be leading us know what they're doing, and I think that's a very bad thing. I think what history does is show that these aren't clear recurring patterns, but that societies often reach a point where change is likely to occur. I mean, the French Revolution, French society had reached a point where enough people, including those who were privileged on the inside, I mean, that's very important. It wasn't just the sans-culotte. It was the well-to-do aristocrats and the bourgeoisie who didn't trust their own society anymore, didn't trust the king to make the right decisions. And that happened with the Russian Revolution as well. The regime just ran out of steam and people didn't trust it to do its job anymore. And it may be that we're seeing something similar, but it will always be different. You know, every historical change is different because the circumstances are different. But I think if you step back, you can see the folds, I think, is a very nice image.
But do you think that the fold that we're seeing oddly being reprised now is like the 1930s?
Well, in some ways it is. I mean, Mark Twain said, and it's a very, much quoted, he said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it echoes. And I think that's quite good, because we're not the 1930s. In fact, because of the 1930s, we're a different world. If the Nazis hadn't got into power, if Mussolini hadn't decided to join with the Nazis, if the Japanese militarists hadn't taken over, which is very much what was happening in the 30s, and a result, I think, partly of the Great Depression and various other factors, then the world today would be very different. But there are echoes, I think. I mean, the loss of faith of people in their own democracies, I think, is worrying. Growing divisions in society are worrying. The rise of aggressor nations who don't believe in obeying the rules. I mean, the powers they call revisionist in the 1930s were quite prepared to break the rules. I mean, Japan invaded. I often think the First and Second World War began in 1931 in Manchuria. The Japanese invaded it in contravention of all international law, breaking agreements they themselves had signed, and got away with it. And that then, of course, encouraged Mussolini to do the same thing with Ethiopia, encouraged Hitler to remilitarize the Rhineland, and then do Anschluss with Austria, and so on. And I think we're seeing the same thing. I mean, I think what's so important about Ukraine, apart from anything else, is that Putin, if he gets away with it, will encourage others to do the same.
What you say about Manchuria and the Second World War beginning back then raises something I wanted to question you about, which is periodization. I mean, one thing I think that historians have been doing, especially about the aftermath of the First World War, is changing the goalposts. I mean, they're changing the goalposts in other ways. If you think of people like Peter Frankopan, who are trying to make us look at history from completely different angles than war and the conduct of public affairs. But the idea, Robert Gervart and John Horn's work, that the First World War doesn't end in 1918. That if you look at Northern Europe, if you look at the Baltic states, if you look at Central Europe particularly, the violence continues, the killing continues. Have you follow that?
Yes, and I think it's an interesting argument. And I mean, the fighting went on in various ways in the center of Europe till 1925. There was fighting in Afghanistan, fighting in the Middle East. It was, I think, a number of taboos had been broken. Again, that you don't seize your neighbor's land by force. And I think there was a brutalization and a violence in society, which may well have been the result of the First World War itself. The Germans had the Stahlhelm, the organizations of veterans who were thugs and went out and beat people up and tried to extend German control into the Baltic states and the Freikorps. So I think, yes, I think the aftermath of the First World War ended technically on November 11th, 1918, but its ripples, Winston Churchill said, the wars of the giants have ended and the wars of the pygmies have started. And they did go on. And I think that is dangerous. I mean, the other thing, we tend to think too much in decades. Decades don't change neatly. You don't move, into 1930 and suddenly the world is different. Changes often happen over time. But sometimes it helps to look at a period. And I think the interwar years, should be looked at as a whole. And we need to understand more about that. And I think we need to understand more about the ending. I mean, historians do talk, and I think it makes a sort of sense about the ending of the long 19th century in 1914, how that then led to the 20th century and the century of total war that we saw.
Yes. Well, the question of periodization and beginnings and endings, a book which now is barely read, I suppose, but which I do keep coming back to, is George Dangerfield's The Strange Death of Liberal England. Because it seems to me no one has yet really answered the questions he raised. Whether the First World War is a caesura that cuts across an era of stability and calm and the Edwardian state of mind and everything, or whether that is fracturing, as I think it was, from the very early 1900s.
Well, I think there were huge divisions. I mean, there was a growing and increasingly militant working class movement, not in all countries. And in England, it became part of the political realm. And the Labour Party, which terrified a lot of middle class and upper class people, in fact became part of British politics. But in other countries, the divisions became greater, the antagonisms became greater. You were getting riots and street battles before the First World War. But I still think that what helped to contribute to the First World War was the sense in most societies, not Russia, Russia was, I think, a different case, that, you know, for all our problems, things are still getting better. And we are Europe. I mean, there was a European consciousness. And Europe did, after all, dominate the world. I mean, you know, we grew up with those maps of colored pink for the British Empire, and I think the French were blue, and somebody was green. Germany was green, I think. That the world was dominated by Europe, that Europe was in the forefront of civilization. Yes, it had its problems. So at the same time as this anxiety about what was happening in society and this fear of revolution and concern about the rapidity of change, there was a wonderful thing at the French Exposition, the French World's Fair of 1900, where Le Monde had an article about moving sidewalks and said, don't get on them, they'll juggle up your internal organs and you'll never be the same. So there was this fear of things moving too quickly. But I think there was also, paradoxically almost, a sense that we are so civilized, we are not going to do anything foolish like a major war. That's what they do in the Balkans, or that's what they do in Africa, or that's what they do in Asia, but not us. And so you have this uneasy sort of balance. Some people apprehensive, concerned, but also a sense, I think, of a lot of people that we just don't do war anymore. You know, we'll sort our problems out. I don't know if you agree, but...
Well, I think there's a danger of easy expectations that we have to re-examine.
Yeah.
And I think if there's one thing history helps you do is try and realize that you can't put faith in those easy expectations. It's like the idea that entering the democratic system will domesticate violent parties. I mean, we've seen that in Irish history. We've seen it more or less work in Irish history. Yeah. We've seen it spectacularly not work elsewhere, notably in Russia.
Yeah, and we've seen, yes, we've seen, well, and Germany and Italy too, where Mussolini and Hitler used democratic processes to get into office and then destroyed democracy. You know, it took Hitler about a year to pass the Enabling Act and basically it finished German democracy. So I think, and we're seeing today in Orban's Hungary, I think, someone who is antipathetic to democracy but has used the levers provided for him in a way to establish his own control. So I do think expectations and what James Joll, who I think is a great historian, called the unspoken assumptions. You know, the things we all take for granted, so we don't really talk much about them.
Yes, the unspoken assumption, which, well, one example of exactly that, I think, is our assumption that integration and mingling in structurally divided societies is automatically a good thing and will bring about a peaceful resolution or outcome. But I think we both read a book that struck us by Tim Wilson called Frontiers of Violence, that compares what's happening in the early 20s in Upper Silesia and Northern Ireland. Upper Silesia, mass rapes, terrible massacres, pogroms between the German identifying and the Poland identifying elements of the society. Northern Ireland, violence certainly, but contained far more effectively and far less aggressively than in Upper Silesia. And his conclusion is that that's because the boundaries of society, of the different elements in society in Upper Silesia were porous. 90% people follow the same religion, they went to school together.
Yeah.
When violence broke out, it therefore took a more extreme form because the boundaries had to be reinforced.
Yeah.
Northern Ireland was structurally, Ulster as then as was still mostly called, was structurally divided through education, through religion, and this enforced a certain kind of limitation on physical violence when it broke out. I put that rather awkwardly, but that's more or less the thesis.
I think it's a wonderful book and should get more attention because I think it applies to other societies as well. And what I remember from it also is he said that in Upper Silesia, the leaders, or the self-proclaimed and self-appointed leaders of these different ethnic groups, used violence to enforce group solidarity. And once you've been part of a violent group beating up your neighbors, the divisions grew. And the same thing happened. There's a very interesting book called, of course, I can't remember the name now, about a village in Bosnia, which was a mix of Muslims and Serbs and Croats. And they all got on very well with each other. They all got in the plum harvest and made what sounds like the most disgusting slivovitz, and they all got drunk, including the Muslims. You know, it was a very happy sort of village. I think they didn't intermarry much, but they all got on with each other. And then the outsiders, when the trouble started in the 90s, the outsiders came in and said, you can't be sitting down with those people, they're not like you. And the village was torn apart. And I do say, it's called Blood and Belonging, no, it's Blood and something, anyway, but it's got this point that it's often outside forces or self-appointed communal leaders who want to do, you know, because it gives them status and gives them a position. They
Very
want
like
to tear.
Eva Hoffmann's book Shtetl is very much the same thesis, examining the life of a Polish Shtetl village before, as I say, the fractures come in from outside and people are told that they must not live together in that way.
Yeah. And suddenly what was a very small distinction becomes a major one. I had a wonderful student in Toronto once who came from Sarajevo, and his father was a journalist there his last name was Muslim. So he said, I'm Muslim, but my father never did a thing about it. He said every so often he'd say, you're losing your heritage, and he'd insist that the children go to a mosque. And then he said it was quite clear his father didn't know what to do in the mosque either. You know, he was sort of trying to, you know, and his mother was Croat. And he said it didn't matter. You know, I went to school in Sarajevo, it didn't matter at all. But suddenly the trouble started. My last name meant that some people wouldn't talk to me, that I became an object of hate. And he was he came to Canada, and I think he thrived, but he said it just fell to pieces. An identity that had never mattered to me. Well, it's like integrated Jews in Germany in the 1920s, 1930s, who was thoroughly German. And in 1939, even with everything that had happened to the Jews, you know, Jewish men still tried to volunteer for the German armed forces. But it was imposed, it was brought in often from outside, I think.
Yes, the world that Tom Stoppard surveys in his last play, Leopoldstadt. Very, very much that. Margaret, thinking about history and what you can tell us, what historians did you first read that made you feel that history could be what you wanted to do? I think about this more and more as I look back over my own professional life.
Well, I always read historical novels, but that doesn't count really, I suppose. I mean, I loved G.A. Henty. Did you ever read G.A. Henty?
Yes.
He wrote moralizing books for Victorian boys, but I didn't realize that girls couldn't read them too. And they always followed a pattern. There was always a poor but very good boy, and then there was the rich but bad boy. And they always, you know, he did them all over the world. With Clive in India, with Kitchener at Khartoum, with so-and-so Pizarro in the Andes. And he was very good on the historical context. And so I think it gave me a taste, even though I knew how the plot would turn out, because it was so, he wrote about 100, I think, but I haven't read them all. But I think at university, well, I heard C.V. Wedgwood, the great British historian, come and talk once when I was at school in England. And she wrote about the Civil War and wrote about that period in the 17th century. And I think I had a picture of historians as very frowsty and sort of covered with dust. And C.V. Wedgwood was extremely elegant. And I thought, oh, you know, you can look like her and still, I've never managed to quite do that, but I just thought, and she was wonderful and funny. But the person who really, I think, influenced me at university was Barbara Tuchman, who just writes, you want to go, she's got the talent of a novelist, I think. You want to read on to know what's going to happen next, even though you know how the story is going to end.
That fascinates me because I loved Barbara Tuchman as well. I remember reading The Guns of August and thinking this is the way history can be written. But you have that novelist's trick too. I can think of various instances in Peacemakers. General, what's his name? General Tasker Bliss, who Margaret describes as preferring to spend his afternoons reclining on his bed reading Thucydides in the original Greek with a hip flask. It's that hip flask that completely gives one the angle that one wants. And the wonderful correspondence between some nice, upright young Canadian officer who unwisely writes back to his wife about how beautiful the women are in Paris, even the tarts on the streets are visions of beauty. Back comes a letter, I'm practically saying I'm coming over on the next boat. Replied to, no, it's too dangerous here. There could be an assassination in the streets. You'd be much better off staying. And she, Mrs., I forget her name, Mrs. what's her name, stays in Canada.
He was Canada's Attorney General, I think, and he said things like, we went to, the Prime Minister, Sir Robert Borden, and I went to the Folies Bergère last night. Very nice women. It's amazing how few clothes they wear. And the letter, I remember it. He had the worst handwriting I've ever seen. How I ever managed to decipher it, because he looped his letters and they went up and down to the next lines. But what he also said in that letter to his wife, he said, "Of course, I would love to see you. But I do warn you, there's probably going to be a revolution here. If you insist on coming," he said, "bring lots of tins of food in your trunk and some stout walking boots, because we'll probably have to walk to the channel if we can get there." Yeah, so she decided Ottawa in the winter was even better. It was better even than that.
She who runs may read.
Yeah.
But I think you would agree that one shouldn't be afraid to write that kind of insight into the general theme of history that you're covering. It's these little aperçus that you get that can only, in my experience, be found from dredging through endless correspondences and diaries and letters. Yeah. And suddenly you have one of those things. I think, did Carlyle say, when the blanket of the dark is lifted, a little chink of light comes in?
Barbara Tuchman called it the corroborative detail. It's the one that sort of fixes it in your mind. And, I remember when Queen Marie of Romania came to Paris. She was quite a beauty, 2 rather lumpy daughters who she was hoping to get married off. But she also hadn't been able to get to Paris to buy her clothes because of the war, and so this was important. But apart from that, she wanted most of Hungary for Romania. And she made a mistake of going to see Woodrow Wilson, who was quite puritanical, the American president, and talked to him about how she'd bought the most wonderful lingerie that morning. And one of his sort of assistants said you could see his support for Romania slipping away moment by moment. But it has those details, and I think we want to, they were people, and we want to have a sense of the person. I'm pretty sure you'd agree with me, but please say if you don't. I think part of our job as historians, we've made livings of this, we've taught it, we've been paid by universities to do it, is to explain to people who are interested what it's about and what the past was about. We can't ever recreate the past, but we can give a sense of what it was like.
Do you think the next generations of historians will get that sense when they are working from not the kind of sources we were working from, when letters and diaries no longer exist, and when the taste for reading extremely long texts in great detail is no longer required of undergraduates in universities?
I know you're very worried about this, that the inability of students to read long books, and it is a worry because there's certain things that you can't explain in TikTok, or you can't explain even in an article. You need to work through a long and complicated story. I think the materials are going to be very different because, and I'm probably said this to you before, but when I was looking at things that from the Foreign Office or from the American State Department, documents were circulated to a very few people. And so everybody knew that only about 9 people would read this top secret document. And you couldn't make copies of it because they didn't have Xerox machines, and you couldn't take a photograph of it because it wouldn't have worked. And so people spoke very freely about, a British ambassador in Germany, for example, in 1914 would write back and say they all seem mad, they all seem to want war here. And I think as a result of both leaks and the ease of copying things, people aren't expressing themselves frankly. That if they do, they know that it could be leaked and they'll get into trouble. So they won't put things down on paper. And they won't put in the sorts of documents, the advice letters documents that they used to do, saying we must do this for the following reasons, because they don't want to have it misquoted.
Right.
And of course, the internet is dreadful because anything you say, even 30 years later, can be found. We're seeing it now. We see it in elections every time. Someone said something stupid when they were 17 and it's held up against them when they're 50. And so people are in public positions are much, much more cautious, which means we won't have the raw materials. We won't know what they were thinking.
Freedom of Information, the Freedom of Information Act specifically, has not been a friend to historical sources, has it?
No.
People are so reluctant to put anything in. What strikes me when I was looking back at Peacemakers before this conversation was the sense of assurance and entitlement and frankness which characterized the exchanges, public and private, of this born-to-rule generation who created the Versailles, and those other treaties like Trianon and Lausanne, which we now forget, but which mean much more to other countries than to us. There's a whole, it's an utterly different culture than the culture of diplomacy and so-called peacemaking today. Would you agree?
I think so, yes, and I think, I mean, governments tended to let their foreign secretaries get on with it. You know, Asquith did not interfere with Sir Edward Grey very much because they tended to appoint people and think they know what they're doing. I think you also had diplomats, you had ambassadors who were much freer in what they could do and were given, it was accepted they would have a certain latitude. Certainly Sir George Buchanan, who was the British ambassador in Petersburg, St. Petersburg before the war, was going quite far in what he was saying to the Russians. And he wasn't always referring back to London. Of course, now with instant communications, I think governments interfere, and often heads of governments interfere much more with their diplomats. And of course, I think I mean, heads of state, government heads of state, love going to summits because they get away from all the tedious domestic stuff and they meet their equals and they have a wonderful time, and they often don't know very much about the subjects. It drives the professional diplomats crazy who then have to try and sort of clean up afterwards. But I think it's not been a good thing entirely because you get far too much micromanaging from Washington or Berlin or London or Paris.
If you want a vivid illustration, read Rory Stewart's recent book on, part of it covers his time in the Foreign Office working under the ludicrous figure of Boris Johnson.
Oh, poor man.
And it is hilarious and chilling in equal measure.
Oh.
I do recommend it.
Oh,
Politics Across the Divide.
I will, definitely. No, I will look for that. But it is, and you get Boris Johnson, remember when he went to Burma and started singing The Road to Mandalay, which is not what I'd choose to sing in Burma, quite frankly, referring to a British invasion of Burma in the 19th century.
Well, you wouldn't choose to say to Leo Varadkar, why can't you be called Murphy like the rest of them?
He didn't.
He did.
Oh, gosh, yeah. Well, why am I not surprised? Oh, dear.
What about memory replacing history, Margaret? I'm in the process, we've accomplished the process of judging an annual prize, an essay prize in memory of the great Hubert Butler, a great figure in Irish cultural history. And the subject of the essay this year was, with the substitution of memory for history, is there any hope for reconciliation?
Well, memories, as we know, can be created or can be distorted. I mean, this idea that memory is something like a carved stone, that once you acquire a memory, it never changes. And we now know that memories are very malleable. And when people claim to remember things, we have to have corroboration. We have to have alternative sources. There's a very good story of Dean Acheson, who was the American Secretary of State in the Eisenhower cabinet. And he came to lunch with a group of friends one day in Washington. He'd met them once a week. And they said, "You seem rather sort of put out today." And he said, "I am." He said, "I was dictating my memoirs to my secretary." And he said, "In 1941, I was there on December the 8th, I think it was the 8th, when President Roosevelt heard about the bombing of Pearl Harbor." He said, "I'll never forget it." And then he said, my secretary, who'd worked for him for years, said, "You weren't. You were in Virginia that day." And he had convinced himself that he'd been there because it was such a crucial moment in American history. Which is why memory, I think, must be treated with respect, but you have to be really careful when you're dealing with people's memories of their own role in particular things. I mean, if it's memories of what the world was like then, it's probably more. But I did a book on British women in India, and I remember interviewing various people for it. And I didn't say, "Were you ever racist?" because that's not a way to get any sort of answer. But they would all start out by saying, "We weren't racist, you know," which was very defensive. And I think, having read the letters from the time, yes, they were often.
Yes, Arno Meyer, the Princeton historian, another Marxist historian who could get things wrong, wrote somewhere that memory was rigid and unchanging, but history was polyvalent or polyvalent, and varied. Completely the wrong way around, I thought. Yeah. Quite surprised me.
Yeah.
But memory is privileged over the historical record in a kind of emotional, cultural way now very often. Yeah. I mean, I'm a great fan of Annie Ernaux, and I believe she richly deserves the Nobel Prize. And I loved The Years, which I think is some sort of great classic of personal testament, but it's not history.
No.
And it is the way that history is now being absorbed and written.
Yeah. Well, I think we privilege emotion too. When people say, I feel, you can't say that because it makes me feel uncomfortable. I think feelings are all very well, and one shouldn't set out to hurt people's feelings, but there are other things than feelings. There's truth. And when people say my truth, as if it's truth itself is malleable, it drives me absolutely bananas. And we have an issue, an interesting issue, I think Australia has it as well, of how much weight do the courts give to Indigenous memory? And they are admitted into courts in land claims, for example. So there's often quite a lot at stake. And when someone says, my grandmother told me that this up to that mountain there was all ours, is that the same as looking at a record? And it's not, but you have to give some weight to it because these are very sensitive issues. But yes, the idea that memory is something that shouldn't be challenged, I think it's tricky, but I think we have to. We have to say, well, how do you remember that? Does anyone else remember it?
I think we have to ask continually, how do you know that?
Yes, yes.
I think it's a question that I keep recurring to when I'm having historical disagreements or arguments with people. Yeah. And it's not always considered a valid route of inquiry now, but it should be.
Yeah. But it's a bit like people who believe in conspiracy theories. And when they say, well, I've been doing my own research, it's on the internet. Well, we know what's on the internet, a great deal of everything. But there is this sense that any truth is equal to another, and my memory is as good as your memory. And when I think of my own memory, no, it's not. I can't remember what happened yesterday. Well, I can remember what happened yesterday thanks to Aer Lingus, but...
Yes, the question of history and memory often brings to mind one of my favourite sayings of Louis Namier, a historian whom I go back to again and again, and whose approach to history was probably conditioned by the fact that he came from Galicia, one of these shatter zones like the Ukraine that we keep recurring in European history. But he said something, I think, on the lines of, when people write about history, you would think that they would remember the past and imagine the future. But instead, they look at their own experience and deduce from that what they think happened in the past. They base their ideas of the future on some memory of personal experience, and they end by imagining the past and remembering the future.
Oh, that's very good.
That's terrific.
Thank you.
It's in an essay called Symmetry and Repetition.
Oh, that's very good, Roy. Yes. It is, yes, and when people project the future, you're probably too young to remember, there was someone called Herman Kahn in the 1950s who was a great nuclear strategist, and he wrote things about how the United States and Russia should prepare for nuclear war, and he coined the phrase megadeaths. Well, he was he was sort of roly-poly, cheerful man, and he would talk about megadeaths and survival, but his view of the future, he came from New Jersey, from one of those Lewis towns which were built just after the Second World War. And his view of the future was the United States that looked like New Jersey in the 1950s. And everyone would have a single family house with a car in the drive. And so he was remembering a future which was based entirely on his own experience. If only we could survive nuclear war, which he wasn't sure we could.
Rightly. Now, I think we're probably reaching a time where we could open things to the audience, but is there anything you wanted to add to what we've...
I want to ask you, do you worry about the future of our profession? Are we becoming redundant? Do we matter still? Do we still need history?
Well, I can't say no, can I?
No. Well, if you wanted to be really pessimistic, but...
It does worry me, as many people in the profession, yourself included, the take-up for history at university level. Yeah. The lack of prioritizing history as a necessary subject at secondary level. Yeah. I think the obsession in England in its current moment with STEM, what they call STEM subjects, at the expense of art subjects, that worries me intensely.
Yeah. Those who talk about STEM subjects often have done classics at university or PPE.
PPE, yeah, absolutely.
Yes. It's sort of reverence for what you don't really understand.
Yes.
But it worries me too sometimes that we are turning inwards and we talk to each other and not to a wider audience. And I think we need to do both.
Well, back to Barbara Tuchman.
Yeah.
And indeed George Dangerfield.
Yeah.
And indeed Peacemakers.
Yeah.
You know, I think a popular historical audience, that does give me hope that there is an audience for books by people like you and Anthony Beaver, Peter Frankerman. I think popular history isn't a bad thing by any means. And I think there is a reading public with an appetite for it. And the people who come to the West Cork History Festival bear it out as well, and other history festivals too.
That's what I read a number of your books, and I was so grateful, for example, for the book on Seamus Heaney, because I'd never really got his poetry and never really, I think, understood it. And you wove the life and the poetry so well together, and you made it comprehensible. You made me want to read more. But you didn't do it in a sort of, you never would, but I mean, some people would take the sort of start with the tone as anyone who doesn't understand Seamus Heaney is a fool. And you didn't, no, but you made it something that opened up and made one want to read more.
Well, thank you. But back to the illuminations, which you mentioned yourself, of fiction as well. I mean, Vasily Grossman, Life and Fate, The Leopard, Joseph Roth's The Radetzky March. You know, there are works of fiction which tell us more and illuminate more the historical moment than anything else.
No, I always used to make my students, when they were graduate students, read novels from the period they were studying. And the good ones always got it. The ones who weren't so good said, why do I have to read a novel? I'm doing history.
Well, that's another depressing factor, that people separate out these things. I think some of the most stimulating teaching I ever did was an MA course in Birkbeck College, which taught mature students. And we had an MA on Victorian studies, which mixed together history and literature. And the great thing was, because they were mature students, they were able to read long books. And you could say, read The Way We Live Now by Trollope over the next fortnight, and they would do it. You could not give The Way We Live Now, one of the great novels of history, to an undergraduate today. They would look at you with appall and measure the thickness and get back to their TikTok.
I think you're too hard. Some of them do read long books, or they listen to them, which is not the same, I know.
Well, it helps.
It helps, I think.
And maybe they do it in Canada. We're back to the superiority of Canada. At which point, having come in a circle, I think we should throw it open to the historians and history-interested people in the audience.
Thank you for listening to the West Cork History Festival podcast featuring Margaret MacMillan and Roy Foster. We hope you enjoyed it. To find more podcasts on other aspects of Irish and international history, please visit our website, westcorkhistoryfestival.org.